Back to another one of our post-coronavirus video lectures on sociological theory. This video is a skeleton key to Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life. My copy is 1995. My English translation is 1995, and it's a very important book, very timely. This video is being created in the midst of a state of exception due to a global pandemic. Many, probably most nations around the world have entered into a state of exception under the, legitimated by responding to the health threat. So social distancing rules and all the other things that we're all getting used to right now are being sort of instituted, sometimes on a voluntary basis, sometimes under state order. I'm in a state, Iowa, that isn't under a mandatory lockdown, which is why I'm actually recording from my office. But many states are. We're seeing protests. I just saw in the state of Nebraska this weekend there were a protest of 4 people protesting, the infringements of liberty of the state of exception that we're in right now. But setting aside some of the the sillier, sort of the funny elements to the contemporary political reaction, I think there's a real reason to be concerned and for serious sociological and political thinkers to be concerned about states of exception. And because they increase the power of sovereigns, they increase state power, and they're a mechanism for generating what Agamben calls Homo Sacer, the person or categories of people who are essentially outside the protections of the law, and outside of the protections even of the moral order. And so these people then live in a state of what he calls bare life. So you get the 3 concepts: Homo Sacer, sovereign power as the agency that declares a state of exception, which generates bare life, and the person who's placed in the position of bare life is Homo Sacer. So these are 3 of the main concepts of the book. I have an image of one of the West Texas ICE internment camps. So we're going to find by the end of the book that Agamben argues that the internment camp or the concentration camp modeled, or at least the archetype of which, was the camps deployed by the Nazis during World War II, that these have become a kind of defining structure of the political order in our time, and that the biopolitical order, we're going to be talking about what that means, is something that can be located within, sort of seen in kind of our ideal type form, a Weberian ideal type form in camps. And when I first read this book, it seemed important, but it was prior to the Syrian crisis and the wave of refugees and the camps that were being created all throughout around the Mediterranean and elsewhere, and the crackdown on migrants, the building of new walls and fences around national borders, a kind of political reaction against migrants all throughout global modernity, really. And clearly before the election of Donald Trump and the political campaign that was largely focused upon identifying people who aren't true Americans or real Americans, and then controlling migration, controlling refugees, controlling others, racial others, and so on. And so many of the themes that Agamben is writing about in the 1990s didn't seem that apparent when I first read the book, but after, say, 2012, the book has just seemed more and more and more significant. So Agamben's been writing, developing. This Homo Sacer project is essentially, I think it's a 7-book set now. So some of the themes that he's developing here, he also develops in other books, some of which I have here. I've been reading most all of them. They're interesting. So before we begin this book, let's look at some of Agamben's others. I'm holding, State of Exception, was going to be a major term here, right? That the sovereign power is the person, following Carl Schmitt, right? The Nazi jurist. The state of exception is declared by the sovereign power and generates bare life, right? And so the book, draws attention to the state of exception as a weapon that's been used almost a universal tool or mechanism for generating a totalitarian state power. So modern totalitarianism can be defined as the establishment by means of the state of exception, right? Declaring an emergency, declaring and grabbing emergency powers, martial law, those kinds of things. So it's the establishment of a legal civil war that allows for the physical elimination not only of political adversaries, which is problematic, but of entire categories of citizens who for some reason cannot be integrated in the political system. So going after political enemies directly, using the heightened powers that the emergency provides as a mechanism to crack down on political opponents, being differential in how you're treating political friends versus political enemies, those kinds of things. And then so the state of siege, kind of a siege mentality, is really important. Suppression of constitutional rights is something that usually goes along with the state of exception. Really important that the lawmaking tends to bypass the legislature. So the legislative branch tends to be neutered during a state of exception, and that therefore power tends to flow to the executive, the unitary executive, the decisionism theory of Carl Schmitt is important here. So states of exception, states of emergency are mechanisms, or tools, or techniques that can be deployed in an anti-democratic way. And so he writes about that here. Other books. So he makes a lot about the concept of the form of life and the relationship between the law and life. One of his books that I really, really have learned a lot from is The Highest Poverty, Monastic Rules and Form of Life. So if you're looking for people who are living in something like a state of exception, who are living outside of the normal rule of law, medieval monasteries certainly fit that, right? They're not really part of the overarching legal order, and yet they're not living naturally, right? So they're not like living like animals. Instead, they're living in these communities where there's a voluntary adherence to a non-legal rule, right? And so it's not a legal system. It's not a legally potent system. So it's not law. It isn't a set of laws that are imposed upon the monks. Instead, it's a rule that's voluntarily embraced. So it's a bit like voluntary servitude. Labatie's notion of voluntary servitude. And he's writing about like the Benedictine orders. He writes about how instead of having a law that kind of rules over people, that these monasteries had the rule of the master, which is really sort of like a set of rules for everyday life, all kinds of things about, rules about how to get dressed, what you wear, those kinds of things, as well as rules of conduct and morality and that kind of thing. And that this rule book essentially becomes a liturgy. So it's a total liturgization of life and a vivification of liturgy. So what happened in these monasteries is that the like at meals, the rule would be read, and it was like a continuous reading of the rule, a perpetual reading of the rule, and that the even while working, the monks would memorize the rule and would actually repeat the rule almost like on a loop in their consciousness. It's a little bit like Catholic adherents. I think of some of my elderly relatives who would have said the rosary almost like on autopilot, that the rule of the order, the law of the order, the law-like rule of the order would be repeated over and over again. And this means that all of life is being formed in accordance with the rule, and the rule itself is becoming, again, the primary content of consciousness. So again, it's a group of people living in a state of exception. They're outside of the normal legal structure, but they're not actually in a state of nature. They're in this this self-chosen world of voluntary servitude. He's got a book, Opus Dei, on the archaeology of duty, and we'll sort of leave that out. But in here, he's just been following up on a variety of arguments and empirical cases, and doing, really it's a genealogy of Homo Sacer, and like I said, he's on about his 7th book right now. Okay, so let's just try to kind of get into it. I decided this time I'm going to really adhere very closely to the text, to the book itself, and but we'll begin with just sort of with the introduction to the book. It's short. It's about, 10 pages, something like that, 14 pages, 12 pages. And so in this introduction, he winds up giving us many, not all, but many of the core concepts that he develops through the rest of the book. He gives very spotty definitions of it, so it's kind of frustrating to read because you're hoping for, you don't quite feel like you have the concept in mind as you're reading. But he's just sort of introducing you to the characters. It's almost like at the beginning of a Shakespeare play where you've got the list of characters, sort of what he's doing here, giving you a kind of a mini sketch of the full argument. So let's begin with some of the big concepts that are described in the opening section of the book. First of all, the distinction between zoē and bios, or bios. And I tell you what, why don't we read the list, then we'll just actually work through it. So that's the first one. So zoē refers to bare life. It's simple life, natural life, probably in the realm of economics or the old-fashioned notion of economics. Zoē is explicitly life excluded from politics, or not, not political, not moral life really. It's a life that's focused in on simple reproduction, essentially, right? So and then bios refers to the politically qualified life, he calls it. It's the life of the city. It's the life that's structured by values, the life that's structured by adherence to a political order. So zoē is sort of a universal existence of life, being alive, enjoying, almost cut off from the political order. Bios is politically qualified, meaningful life, that kind of thing. Living life that's structured by a moral and legal and symbolic system. Okay, so there's the distinction. So neither of these are fully, bare, like natural life completely. You get close to it with zoē, but there's usually some element of the social embedded in zoē as well as in bios. But that's the main distinction. Okay, so biopolitics refers to the move in modern society away from the politics of territory into a politics that focuses in on a population and on the natural and biological functioning and well-being, almost, not quite, but well-being of a population. So managing birth, death, sex, managing population movements and flows, worrying about who's getting in and who's going out, worrying about eugenics, reproduction, all of those kinds of things. Biopolitics, again, anything to do with reproduction, abortion, healthcare rights, those kinds of things, all biopolitics. The notion is coming really from Foucault's, late writings from the history of sexuality forward. Another concept. So interestingly enough, biopolitics in Agamben's world is actually closer to zoē politics. It's the politics of bodies and of reproduction, more or less simple life. And so basically biopolitics, he's going to say, is a world in which zoē and bios wind up collapsed on top of each other. They enter into a zone of indistinction. So this is a term that he uses often. So zone of indistinction, you'll see it in my notes as we're going, is it really occurs where you have two sort of like different orders or concepts or distinctive ideal types that merge. And so you're at a zone of indistinction when the difference between bios and zoē, or between we'll say the profane world and the sacred world collapse onto each other. And although that would be pretty impossible, but at any rate, where they collapse upon each other and you get them overlapping like that, where one is essentially indistinguishable from the other, so that the contours here of zoe and the contours of bios are going to be the same. So that's the zone of indistinction. You reach the zone of indistinction where the two circles of, or you could be any shape, but where the contours and the structuration of two normally conceptually distinct ways of life or regions of life are mapped onto each other and become indifferent at that point. In our earlier discussion of Baudrillard's Age of the Simulacra was where distinctions, core distinctions and oppositions collapsed, telescope down, he called it, right? That this is really what he's talking about. So the zone of indistinction is where two categories that are normally opposite essentially become one. The difference between them goes away. And then sometimes he writes about the threshold that is right at the boundary separating two things, right? So again, like bios and zoe, there's going to be a threshold or something along those lines. Okay. Sovereign power is a concept that he uses throughout the book. So he uses it specifically, in a sense, taken from Carl Schmitt. I have Carl Schmitt's political theology, concept of the political. I think it's actually coming from political theology more than anything. And Carl Schmitt's book Dictatorship. So Schmitt is essentially a Weberian student in Germany, and really was doing legal scholarship, was essentially a jurist for the Nazis, and wound up really developing the concept of sovereignty very completely here. So it's very famous at the beginning of Schmitt's book. I'll just get to it. It's the first line of the book. You can't miss it, right? Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So if you're ever going to quote anything from Schmitt, there it is, right on the first page. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So the person who is sovereign is the person who's able to essentially suspend the law, or set aside the law, or declare a state of exception or state of emergency or martial law. In other words, if you're sovereign when you can say the law doesn't exist anymore. I am the law, right? So again, that's sort of a dictator at that point. So whenever he's writing about sovereign power, he's really writing about the specific ability for the sovereign to define a state of exception, to set aside the law, which means that the sovereign then becomes the speaking law or the speaking power of the society. So it's something like dictatorship at that point. Okay. And usually when he's talking about it, he's usually talking about it in terms of the sovereign exception. So the sovereign has the ability to say who, these basic lines of who is in a state of exception, or what regions or locations would be in a state of exception, or what time we're going to be in a state of exception, or what the state of exception is going to contain. So the sovereign exception is declared by the person who holds sovereign power. And again, to Schmitt, those two things collapse into each other. Okay, the structure of the exception there, or the state of exception, it takes on the structure again of martial law or emergency powers, something along those lines. But the essential thing is it's not natural life, and it's not normal political life. It's the state of exception is going to be this zone in between natural life and political life, right? So it's not quite pure zoe or pure bios. It's in the middle. Okay, Homo Sacer, that's the person who's essentially living a bare life, so is going to be living in the state of exception. Has been defined as the person who is essentially outside of the world of bios, outside of politics, and therefore is forced to live a bare life. So we're going to get more to the definition of that later. There's always the double determination of Homo Sacer. So they're sacred or they're taboo, both meanings essentially. So this is the person who cannot be sacrificed, so they've become irrelevant or impotent really in the larger political order. At the same time, they've become unprotected. They're outside the law, so they no longer are protected by the juridical legal system. Hence, they can be murdered without without recourse. So no homicide. Okay. So you're living essentially outside the law, outside the legal protection, and outside of religious significance too. So it's this zone of life that has a particular structure that we're going to talk about as we go. Okay. Okay. We'll kind of leave it there. All right. So as we get inside of chapter 1 then, so he opens with a distinction between the two concepts, right, of life. So there's it's zoē, bare life, which he describes as kind of universal life, unqualified life, life that's simple, life that's natural. It's generally down here. We're going to jump down. On page 2, he uses this is an Aristotelian distinction, always kept distinct between bios and zoē. Reproductive, zoē is reproductive, rooted in subsistence, economics, essentially, earning a living, that kind of thing. Mere fact of living, the mere living itself, the realm of economics or the oikos, and family, a kind of stupefied existence in the sense of being, again, outside of the larger moral order, without striving for moral and ethical political ends, right? Without living in accordance with the full symbolic structure, that kind of thing. So you're outside of politics. It's always a carve out from politics. Bios then refers to, I would say, moral life. So it's particularized, it's submitted to and embedded within a symbolic order in the Lacanian sense. It's a particularized way of life. It's a qualified life. It's an ethically or legally or politically qualified life. It's life in society, mores, structured by a symbolic order, those kinds of things. It's the good life, he says, in the Aristotelian sense, the good of life in common, structured, particularized, a moral order. The realm of politics is always embedded and even defined by bios, and it always defined by excluding the economic or zoē. Which excludes politically unqualified life. So that's always kept distinct. So if you're going to use substitute terms, bios is politics, zoē is life outside of politics, or life outside of almost a juridical legal order. You're primarily concerned with reproduction of the physical self, reproduction of the material self, those kinds of things. Page 2 to 3, all life has a zoē. All life does, no matter in what society you're in. It's just a universal category. And only humans fall out of simple living, pleasure and pain, and into the realm of value. So living human beings who are just sort of living their life in the realm of pleasure and pain, the world of economics, essentially, right? Calculations of pleasure and pain, are distinct then from those who are living according to values. And if values are sort of fed, fueled, and maintained by dead labor, then the realm of values is essentially a realm where you're living in accordance with the dead to a degree, whereas zoē is, life as such, right? Okay, so the world of bios is justice. The concept of just and unjust overrides the concept of pleasure and pain, and this aligns with Schelling's sort of worldview of nature. Again, not completely, but largely the realm of zoē, natural, beings of the real, organic drives. We fall out of nature essentially into something like political society, bios, symbolic world, linguistic order, legal order, values, those kinds of things. So again, I think we'll just use for the rest of this video that biological life, natural life, is largely contained in the concept of zoē. Although when I read it, I get a little bit more than that out of it. And then moral life in society, a politically organized society, is bios. Okay. Page 3, he talks about biopower, getting this from Foucault's History of Sexuality. Modern politics, he argues, is where the government is primarily concerned with the natural health and reproduction and of a state of population. So a state is defined in terms of its population, whereas in the past, the state had been defined in terms of its territory. Okay? So the technologies of state power shift and they're directed at managing simple human bodies, essentially, right? And the well-being and maintenance and reproduction of human bodies. So biopolitics, again, is actually closer to zoē-politics. Again, a concern with population dynamics, using social science as a mechanism to maintain these things, and so on. Okay. Page 3 and 4, he's using Arendt's Human Condition. She writes about Homo laborans, I pronounce it that way, humans as makers, humans as producers, humans as laborers. But again, he's going to argue that this falls largely within the economic realm, and laboring towards the reproduction of life itself keeps you out of politics. So to enter into politics in modernity, at least prior to modernity, to participate in the labor process largely kept you out of the realm of politics. In medieval Europe, it's very clear, right? In medieval and in feudalism, politics was only the realm of the aristocratic caste or churchmen, and those groups excluded themselves from the need to engage in economic production. But modern societies begin to incorporate peasants and the third estate into politics. So the groups that were excluded from politics, the producers, the workers, the laboring classes, become part of politics in modernity. And so what that means to Agamben is that modern politics is a world where zoē and, again, and bios are essentially become indistinguishable from each other, where zoē is at least incorporated into, begins to be incorporated into bios, okay? And then it depends upon the moment that you're in. Again, in the state of exception, they become the same, and otherwise they're just an incorporation of zoē into bios. Okay, more on that later. So in modernity, yeah, it's sort of like the economy is stupid, that politics itself becomes about managing the well-being of communities of people, paying attention to economics and so on. Okay. All right. Yeah, so then he writes about how neither Arendt nor Foucault paid attention to each other sufficiently. Not surprising, but at any rate, he valorizes Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism and Foucault's analysis of biopolitics, and then wishes that Arendt would have incorporated Foucault's concepts of biopolitics into her analysis of totalitarianism and camps, and he very much wishes Foucault would have incorporated an analysis of concentration camps into his studies of institutions of power and exclusion and normalization and so on. Okay, so on page 4 then, he argues that the decisive event of modernity is the entry of zoē-bios into the sphere of bios or politics, right? So the politicization of life as such, the subsumption of natural life, or we're going to call it value, or the world of value in Marx's term, becomes something that is very much contained by politics, which is the realm of old-fashioned values, we'll say, in the in sort of the Durkheimian sense. So again, monitoring laboring bodies and those kinds of things, controlling laboring bodies become, and again, not just controlling with law, but actually regulating and disciplining and incorporating and generating particular kinds of laboring bodies and values. This becomes something that gets absorbed into a politics. So this is the foundational event of modernity. In modernity, when politics no longer is concerned with territories, territorial expansion, and so on, but where it shifts into the management and curation and technological control of essentially of bodies and living beings. So the zoē-bios collapse is the core category to explain and comprehend modern societies, including Nazism, as we're going to talk about later. All right, so given that biopolitics now collapsed and old political oppositional categories also collapse, again, this is a little bit like Baudrillard, left-right collapses, private-public collapses, absolutism and democracy dissolve. They dissolve into a zone of indistinction, so that, again, all of these different categories used to be distinct. They move on to each other. They become indistinguishable. The difference between them loses meaning. So he is looking for a kind of movement into a kind of progressive or politics of zoē-bios overlap. That isn't totalitarian, or that doesn't depend upon a state of exception. So he's going to make that argument. The state of exception, these two categories of living collapse onto each other, are coextensive with each other, and that we need to rethink, he believes, politics, democratic politics, essentially, in order to move out of a state of exception and into something like a normal, valued political life. So Foucault's analysis of power then, again, just try to get this through his... he studies the way that concrete ways that power penetrates subjects' very bodies and generates forms of life. He has the double problem of political technologies and technologies itself, and that these wind up combined in his work. So the merger of self-technologies with political techniques is important. And again, so this is his world, the inclusion of bare life in the political realm, that this is the nucleus of sovereign power in modernity. All right? So it's biopower, the production of a biopolitical body, is the original activity of sovereign power. So he makes the argument that this isn't true just of modern society, but that it was always there. So he tries to take what's characteristic now and is trying to find traces of this back in the past. More on this. I'll try to leave some of this out. So the sovereign manages the distinction between zoē and bare life. Zoē is bare life and bios, the good life. Western politics originally excluded bare life as an exception from practical